Alright, chat. The video I want to watch is called How a Man Solved His Own Murder Before Dying. I don't know how good this channel is. It got recommended to me. I was like, that's something I'd enjoy watching. So we're going to watch it while I eat my food. I hope that's okay.
A man drags himself to the hospital, checking in for extreme vomiting and stomach pains. His condition quickly worsened, and he insisted he had been poisoned. Determined to seek justice, he pieced together the events that led to his sudden illness. He'd had a lunch meeting with a friend the day he fell sick, and then went to discuss a business venture with an old colleague from his home country. As he lay on what he knew was his deathbed, he recounted several hours of incredibly detailed witness testimony, vital puzzle pieces which enabled investigators to solve his inevitable murder. A case that involved three men.
I always think that poisonings like just don't happen anymore, but they really do. Chat, if you haven't already, you should get a snack.
In the fall of 2006, the journalistic world was shocked by the death of Anna Politkovskaya, a prominent investigative journalist and human rights activist. She was known for her work exposing Russian actions in Chechnya and her refusal to back down from reporting the facts despite many threats. Only a few months before her passing, the Russian parliament had passed a new law that allowed the FSB, the Federal Security Service, to eliminate anti-Russian activists and extremists in any country in the world. Their
19
definition
minutes,
included
20.
anyone who made comments about the Russian government that could be considered slander. Anna was already terrified for her life because she knew the Russian government was very interested in silencing their critics. But these new circumstances did not bode well. Earlier that year, in a London cafe, Anna had confided her fears to Alexander Litvinenko, a close friend and fellow Russian investigative journalist who was living in England. Alexander begged her to flee Russia, hide, and protect herself. But Anna felt that she could not. She had people she needed to take care of, her children and elderly parents. But only 3 months after the law was passed, Anna was assassinated in her Moscow apartment. The incident affected Alexander deeply. Determined to point the finger at the people responsible, Alexander attended a journalist gathering for Anna in London and publicly accused Putin of ordering the death of his beloved friend. Anna was not the only Russian critic who was a target. Alexander himself was a journalist who wrote about the hidden crimes of the SFB and corruption. It was likely that he was already a target, but his public statements about Anna's demise put him at great risk. Alexander was born in Russia when the country was part of the USSR. He joined the Soviet army at age 17, trained for 4 years, and started raising a young family. After 5 years, Alexander was transferred to Moscow to work at Internal Affairs, and it wasn't long before the KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence office, hired him as an agent. Alexander worked in military counterintelligence and also investigated organized crime, terrorism, and corruption. Though the Soviet Union eventually fell, he stayed with his crime investigation team, which was now under the control of the FSB. During this time, he separated from his wife and fell in love with a woman named Marina. The FSB assigned Alexander to investigate an attempt on the life of Boris Berezovsky, a wealthy businessman and prominent government official who was close with Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president at the time. While on this case, Alexander and Berezovsky became good friends, and both of them started quietly questioning the government's actor and Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president at the time. While on this case, Alexander and Berezovsky became good friends, and both of them started quietly questioning the government's actions. Alexander's next assignments took him to Chechnya, a region that wanted to separate from the regime. Seeing so much casual loss of life and indifference towards civilians horrified Alexander. Disillusioned, he returned to Moscow. Though he continued to rise in the ranks of the FSB, Alexander increasingly believed his superiors were corrupt criminals. He ignored their orders when he felt they were wrong, like to kidnap a Chechen businessman or the arrest and battery of an FSB whistleblower. Defying orders was a bold decision, and it's possible he could have been punished for it. But Alexander remained safe. For now. Then, one day, he received an order that would change his life: to assassinate Berezovsky, his friend and confidant that he was employed to protect. By now, Vladimir Putin was the head of the FSB. Alexander was identified as a problem, fired for his refusal to follow orders, and targeted for disloyalty and challenging the government. He was suddenly charged with various crimes, like allegedly roughing up a suspect, a case he spent 8 months in jail for before being found not guilty. As the verdict was given, masked men entered the courtroom and arrested Alexander again. It was clear that he would be suppressed by any means necessary. He was then charged with stealing ammunition and explosives and faced 8 years in prison. Alexander knew he had no future in Russia now that he was a target. With Berezovsky's help, he and his family ran away to England, where they applied for asylum. Berezovsky had recently fled to London and hired Alexander as part of his personal security team. Now that he was not under constant threat, Alexander was able to voice his beliefs publicly and report on what he had seen during his employment with the Russian government. He became an author and investigative journalist, focusing on exposing the hidden crimes of the FSB and Russian corruption. He called Russia corrupt and said the government, crime, and intelligence industries were one and the same. He also became a consultant for MI6, the British spy agency, an informant for Spain on the Russian criminal network there. Years after Alexander moved to London, Andrei Lugovoy, an old colleague, contacted him. Andrei had been a member of Berezovsky's security team in Russia at the same time as Alexander, and he got back in touch with Alexander to discuss a business opportunity. The two men decided to work together and advise Western companies to invest in Russia. Just a few weeks after Anna's passing and Alexander's public accusations, Andrei traveled to London for a business meeting with Alexander. He brought another man, Dmitry Kovtun, with him. According to the staff at the hotel they stayed in, the two men looked like stereotypes of Eastern European gangsters, with loud, ill-fitting suits, bright shirts and ties, and clunky jewelry. The three men met in a boardroom at Irenis, an intelligence firm in London, and were hosted by Tim Riley, the head of the firm. This was the first time Alexander had met Dmitry, who introduced himself as Andrei's business partner, but he felt an instinctive dislike for him. They discussed the weather. Then Andrei joked about how it would be appropriate for them to have some tea, since they were in England and the British were known for their love of tea. Tim made tea for his guests, and the meeting was underway. Later that day, after the meeting had finished, Alexander felt unwell and had to throw up, but recovered quickly. The two Russians flew back to Moscow, but Andrei came back to London only a week later, this time alone. He met with Alexander in the Palm Court bar at an upscale hotel. The two drank tea and discussed their business idea further. The following week, Andrei and Dmitry were back in London yet again. This time, they were accompanied by Andrei's wife and kids, and another friend. The group was on a trip to watch a football match, CSKA Moscow playing Arsenal in a Champions League. But while they were in town, wanted to meet up with Alexander again. Alexander already had plans for the day and was meeting an Italian associate for lunch. He got a call from Andrei around noon.
You think they tried to poison him the first time, it wasn't enough?
Alexander agreed, and Andrei told him to come to the Millennium, an expensive hotel in London. As Alexander ate lunch with his friend, Andrei constantly called him, impatient, urging him to hurry up as they would have to leave for the football match soon. Alexander got to the Millennium at 4 p.m., and Andrei approached, inviting him to come sit at the bar. Andrei had already been ordering drinks for himself, but he knew that Alexander didn't drink alcohol. He was also living very modestly at the time, and wasn't planning to order and pay for anything expensive at this luxury hotel. So when the bartender asked Alexander if he would like anything, he said no. Andrei then offered Alexander some tea from a pot that was on the table, and asked the waiter for a clean mug. There wasn't much tea left, maybe a half cup, and it was already cold. Alexander took a few polite gulps, but didn't finish it. The two were then joined by Dmitry. The three men had a meeting the next day with a private security firm who was interested in investigating in Russia. Their discussion at the Millennium Hotel bar lasted only 20 minutes before they went their separate ways. As he was leaving, Alexander had the strangest feeling that he was in danger, and the two men he had met were not his friends. That evening, Alexander became violently sick and had to be hospitalized. Doctors didn't know what to do,
Bro's
His
thinking,
mixture
I'm
of
never drinking tea
symptoms,
ever
including
again.
bone marrow failure and gut damage, perplexed medical staff, who suspected a form of poisoning but could not pin down a specific diagnosis. His condition worsened over the next few weeks, and after
What about
17
Boba?
days of illness, Scotland Yard was alerted to the fact that a man was in the hospital sick from suspected poisoning that could have been a murder attempt. Officers came to
17
visit
days.
Alexander and investigate the cause of his sudden sickness. As the officers questioned Alexander, they discovered that he was not only an excellent witness, but an investigator himself.
We haven't
As
finished
he
it
lay
yet, yeah.
bedridden, he was
I took a
trying to
food break.
solve his own attempted assassination. Alexander had a lot of detective experience and strong observational skills from his time in the FSB. He described in detail the appearance, height, clothing, and mannerisms of the people he had come into contact with, where and when he met them, and his interactions, recounting conversations from start to finish. Combing through the events leading up to his illness, Alexander plainly stated that only 3 people could have possibly poisoned him. He highlighted his Italian associate, but didn't really suspect him, as well as Andre and his business partner whose name Alexander guessed at, but couldn't quite remember. This was Dmitri. In total, Alexander provided an incredible 9 hours of witness testimony that would be vital to solving the case. He even called his wife and asked her to search their home for an old photo of Andre. Alexander was firm in his belief that the Secret Services was behind the poisoning, and convinced that the serious action of exterminating a citizen of another country had to have been approved by Putin himself. As Alexander recorded his interviews, he grew sicker and sicker, and his lawyer started to draft a statement for him. It spoke about Alexander's love for his wife, how proud he was to be British, and that he blamed the Russian government and president for his poisoning. His statement said, "You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life."
And
Just
pause.
days later, Alexander went into cardiac arrest. He was resuscitated and put on a life support machine in an induced coma. During this period, Scotland Yard received a call from a lab that had analyzed Alexander's urine. They confirmed that he had been poisoned by radioactive polonium-210,
fuck.
which had never been known to enter England before. Alexander passed away 6 hours later on November 23rd, 2006,
Holy shit.
as the first known victim in the world of polonium-210 poison. Alexander was gone, and investigators had to rely on
must
his
be so
deathbed
scary,
testimony
like,
to point them in the right direction for
finding
evidence.
that it is poison.
Polonium is
It's
an
like, shit,
extremely
that's kinda
radioactive
crazy.
substance,
Isn't it
and
funny
when
how it's a
ingested or
substance that-
inhaled, one of the most toxic poisons in the world. It can't pass through physical barriers, such as human skin, so as long as it doesn't enter the body, it's safe to handle. But if even the smallest amount is ingested, it does terrible harm to the victim's organs and can take their life. A tiny speck
Must
of
be
the
scary to then
substance,
realize
the
that
size
it's
of a
in the
pinhead,
country.
is
You didn't even know
3,000
it was in the
times
country at
legal
all.
dose for humans. It is difficult to identify polonium poisoning unless you are looking for it, since the symptoms can look like poisoning from more common substances. It also did not trigger common radiation detectors of the time
And
because
ghost
it
hunters or
only
something?
gives off alpha particles, which can't even pass through a piece of paper.
I love
This
forewarned.
particular polonium sample had come from a nuclear reactor in the Ural Mountains, then processed in a secret FSB lab in Sarov, Russia. Now that the investigators knew what to look for and who to investigate, they began testing the locations where Alexander had been for polonium and gained access to CCTV footage at the Millennium while gathering information on the activities of Andre and Dmitri leading up to the meeting. The entire story was painstakingly pieced together. Dmitri later stated that he arrived at the hotel at 4 p.m., around the same time that Alexander did. CCTV footage showed that he actually showed up in the lobby half an hour earlier. The pair had entered the men's washrooms at the Millennium Hotel, and investigators found an alarming amount of radiation contamination in one of the cubicles. The footage also proved that Alexander never entered the washroom, so Andre and Dmitri had to be the ones who brought in the substance. Forensics found the teapot they must have used because it gave off extremely high readings of polonium, confirming Alexander's theory of having ingested it through the tea he drank. Using the readings, experts located the chairs and the table the men met at, with the highest levels on Dimitri's chair. Traces of polonium were found on the dishwasher, the floor, the till, a coffee strainer, an ice cream scooper, a chopping board, and bottles of alcohol behind the bar. The assassins evidently did not care about potential contamination and risks to other people at the hotel. When forensics tested the hotel rooms of the two men, the polonium levels in Dimitri's bathroom sink were so high that the only conclusion possible was that the remaining amount had been poured down the sink to dispose of it. They also traced the substance all the way back to other locations the assassins had been at, including on the planes they had taken to London. All the clues painted a clear story. The men had been sent from Moscow to assassinate Alexander, setting up false meetings with the intention of getting him to drink poisoned tea. And this was not the only attempt. The location of their first meeting, the boardroom at the intelligence firm, was teeming with radiation. Dimitri and Andre must have poured the polonium into his cup of tea, but Alexander did not drink anything at that first meeting. He narrowly escaped death, but had thrown up once later that day, probably from exposure and breathing near the poisoned tea. Still, he survived without even knowing about the attempt, and the assassins would have to try again. Again, high levels of radiation were found in Andre's bathroom sink where he had stayed, indicating that he poured it down to get rid of it. The unsuccessful assassins then flew back to Moscow, with Andre coming back to London only a week later, this time alone, but with another container of polonium. Alexander had drank tea that time, but it appears that Andre never used the poison. He may have spotted the cameras around the room, or was worried he was being watched. Whatever the reason, he did not use the polonium and again poured the substance down his bathroom sink. The entire washroom and hotel room were highly contaminated, and scientists testing the location asked to be excused from the room for safety reasons. Polonium was very expensive, and having to travel back to London with yet another batch would have been inconvenient. Andre and Dimitri would have been desperate to get it right the third time, and resentful from their previous failures, which may be why Alexander picked up on negative feelings coming from the two men instead of excitement about the potential of their business venture. Andre or Dimitri were so reckless with their handling of the poison that it seems like they were unaware of how traceable and dangerous the poison was. Maybe because they knew it was difficult to detect inside the human body, and traditional instruments detecting poison didn't pick up on polonium. But if you are looking specifically for polonium, the trail it leaves is long-lasting and obvious. And after that third meeting at the hotel, everything Alexander touched gave positive radioactive readings. Despite all the evidence, the judicial process took years and had many delays. Dimitri and Andre both denied involvement in Alexander's poisoning, and actually accused
Why are they using a meme template when this guy got poisoned and killed
the
by
two
a corrupt
Russians would claim that it was
country?
Alexander who first tried to poison them at that initial meeting at Arenas, and so he was the cause of the radiation trail that followed them afterwards. But this was simple to disprove. Alexander's previous locations and possessions had not been contaminated until he met the assassins, whereas investigators could determine every single place the Russians had been by tracing the radioactive trail. Dimitri was actually hospitalized for radiation poisoning a month after he traveled to London from being constantly exposed. Russia had also denied a request from the UK to extradite Andre to face criminal charges. Marina, Alexander's wife, continued to put pressure on officials to investigate and charge the people responsible. 10 years after Alexander passed away, a UK public inquiry found Andre and Dimitri responsible for poisoning him,
10 years
suggested
later
that it was very likely they had acted under orders from their government, and accused Russia of failing to properly investigate the assassination. In 2021, 15 years after the incident, the European Court of Human Rights found Russia responsible for the crime and ordered the state to pay Alexander's wife over 100,000 euros in damages. A Russian spokesperson dismissed the ruling and said Moscow would not pay the penalty. Dimitri passed away in 2021, and as of 2023, Andre is still an MP in Russia's parliament. Neither man ever faced court or imprisonment for the assassination. Alexander was the first confirmed victim of polonium-210 radiation poisoning. 15 years before officials determined the ruling, Alexander himself, while on his deathbed, was able to deduce the series of events and gave a public statement that pointed the finger at the Russian government. His accusations received worldwide media coverage, and the following investigation led to political issues between the UK and Russia. While it's unfortunate that the process took so long, Alexander's family, friends, and supporters finally had some closure, and an official ruling that proves the statements he was so determined to say on his deathbed. Based on our recent video about a man trapped.
But that doesn't mean anything. Like, all they were charged with was 100,000 euros for it'd been 15 years at that point. And they still didn't even pay it. They're like, no, that is insane. And the guy, one of them died, and then the other one is still an active member of parliament. That is crazy. It is actually insane. Man, that was a good video though. I liked it. I liked it a lot. Shout out Baru for that one.